Welcome to the Joseph Bank Society's series of podcasts, Banking on Botany, where we celebrate the lives of those who've shaped the natural world. In this episode, Debbie will dive into the fascinating world of two extraordinary individuals, whose passion for plants and ecology has left a lasting legacy. Professor Mark Seward and E. Joan Gibbons. Professor Seward, a distinguished lichenologist and ecologist, has spent decades exploring the intricate relationships between organisms and their environments. From his pioneering work in urban lichen ecology to his influential tenure at the University of Bradford, his research has deepened our appreciation for biodiversity and environmental stewardship. Alongside his story, we'll journey into the life of Elizabeth Joan Gibbons, a trailblazing British botanist whose dedication to Lincolnshire's flora was nothing short of legendary. As the first woman to publish a county flora, the Flora of Lincolnshire, and a long-serving leader in the Lincolnshire Naturalists' Union, Gibbons combined meticulous fieldwork with a deep love for the history of botany. Together, their stories paint a vivid picture of scientific curiosity, perseverance, and the quiet power of observing the world around us. So, settle in, this is going to be a fascinating exploration of two lives rooted in nature.
So when you were training teachers, you were also recording. Were you a county recorder for this area? You know, like we've got recorders, plant recorders and things for the counties, or are you just doing it for your own?
No, I was a recorder in Lincolnshire for my subject. Well, mosses and lichens, anything that was not, as it were, flowering plants. This was an area which was desperately in need of someone to determine these organisms, because Lincolnshire had lots and lots then of lowland heaths. They looked like heaths, and they had kaluna, heather, and you felt you were on a moorland, although you're in Lincolnshire. And they were very flat, easy to handle. But over the years, of course, they disappeared.
Is that because of drainage and things like that, and building? And
Yes, and really because they were not allowed the right sort of stock of animals that would maintain the heathlands. And very quickly they were invaded by higher plants, and trees indeed have replaced some of those areas that I researched.
And was it sheep grazing then? Because I know Lincolnshire is very famous for its sheep, isn't
It would be, but there wouldn't be too much for a sheep to graze on a heathland. They have selected areas.
That's really interesting. And so botany, so you were a teacher and then you did your masters, but all behind all this, all the time, you've had this love of lichens and...
Well, I have. It's taken over, but not to say that, I don't do other things. For example, when I get to an area, I get interested in all sorts of situations. And for example, in the south of the county, when I was working with the person you want to know about, then in fact, I joined the John Clare Society, because John Chandler, who we're going to talk about, was actually a member of the John Clare Society. And furthermore, John Chandler had actually botanized in all the areas that Clare had botanized. So he could go out and see what were the changes. And I was in the same boat.
So I know that John, he, because I read your piece about him, he also was quite familiar with Joan, wasn't he? Because there was her and another lady, and then John, and they split the vice counties between them, didn't they?
Yes, they did.
Yeah. And she do 54 and he do 53?
That was usually the breakdown, yes.
And is it true also that it's kind of an amazing thing that Lincolnshire's probably got at the time, I don't know if it still stands, because of all the work they did, it was probably one of the best surveyed, botanically, etc., surveyed counties?
It was at that time. I think there have been deficiencies in recent years, yes. Yeah. And it's a big county. That's the thing. And people are rushing, as it were, to Yorkshire, which is an even bigger county, and Norfolk, that's quite a big county. But I think Norfolk has suffered in the same way as Lincolnshire in the Wash area, where there are interesting environments that have certainly declined.
I've just been reading about the fens, Is it no, Francis Pryor.
Yes.
I've just been reading all about the fens and the draining of the fens and all the big washes and and also, of course, Sir Joseph Banks was a big drainer of the fens. So it's kind of starting of the disintegration of that really special landscape. That's only my opinion, of course. But
Well, it is, but the landscape was modified amazingly, drastically and badly by the 1953 floods, because lots of the habitats I had managed to survey before 53 only just disappeared. And the mosses, which were very, very rare, they didn't grow in anywhere else other than, I think, in Lancashire. These mosses on the coastline just disappeared, never to return. That's right. And there were all sorts of heathland-like situations, not the same species, but nevertheless, that type of habitat did disappear.
so I'm actually in awe of you, of the things that you've done in your life, really, and the people that you've met and the people that you know and knew. And being Lincolnshire yellow bellies, as we are, it it's not another thing that fills me with joy about our county, and also a sadness, like the mosses and the lichens and the floods and things that disappear and disappearing landscapes.
Well, you knew a lot through your neighbour, and your neighbour didn't live next door to you. Your neighbour was spread across the county, and wherever you went, you created a dialogue with people that knew something about the county. Their heart was there. Most of these people had never left the county. I had the good fortune, I suppose, over the years, to go away from the county and to talk about it. So all my work I did, of course, in America, that I ran, I had to go over there for 13 years to run this course. I ran courses through Europe and places like that. I was always, as it were, talking about my home county, and to have to do something and have a knowledge of what lives there or what lived there, because the more you spend, the more literature you look at, the more collections you look at. And we're just worrying at the moment about a huge collection in America, where they're contacting me to say, as many others, we want to find a home for this collection. And this was a hub for this kind of activity. And I felt that in Lincoln, I tried at the museum to create a hub. In fact, I gave a collection of material there. I gave it to them, and now they're wanting to give it back to me. So I don't know what you're thinking about this at Banks Society, but I'm deviating a bit.
It's a bit difficult because it's the same across the whole of the museum sector, isn't it? They're closing, they're getting rid of curators, closing down things.
But they didn't tell us. It closed down 2 years ago.
What, Malham Tom?
Malham Trust closed down. The National Trust have taken it over on a temporary basis at the moment. But they've been in touch with me in the last week or two to say, we've got a collection of plants. Do you want them? Would you want them well, they think I've still got a collection at Bradford. But Bradford wouldn't want them either. There's no one there to look after them.
No, which is why we inherit things. We've inherited Joan's collection from the NNU. So, but it's having people with the skills to care for that collection. And the youngsters don't want to do it.
Well, you're lucky to have Jones, because the best collection, of course, was Woodruff Peacock's. And Woodruff Peacock's collection had a very, very checkered history. It was there in Lincoln Museum. You used to go up to the first floor, and there it spread before you. You could work on this collection. And sad to say, the museum went into temporary residence to a place called the Drill Hall. As a consequence of that, people used to open doors and cabinets and say, what's in there? And never put them back in the right place, or took something out and never returned it. Anyway, I gave my collection of mosses to there, and this included every Lincolnshire item that I'd managed to scrape up from other museums like Louth and places like that. They had small collections. I pulled them all together. I made this collection, I don't know what its condition is at the moment, but when it moved back to the museum then didn't want it. So I arranged for Lincoln University to have it. And now Lincoln University have given it to Kew. I say now, they did it quite a few years ago. So moving this collection down to London, woodruff peacock is a rock soil flora of all the plants of Lincolnshire. And this was the first this is the first 2 decades of this last century, the first 2 decades when ecology was only used in Scandinavia.
Well, these are the pioneers.
Yes, and these plants, when you worked on a plant, you got to know everything about them. I think I've shown you the one that he did, an example. But all this manuscript was never published, and yet the top ecologist, botanist of this country, Tansley, wanted to sponsor it. But what with the war and things like that, the First World War, it never got sponsored. But the manuscripts are all at Cambridge, still at Cambridge.
Well, at least somebody's curating them.
Yes.
And caring for them.
Well, this is it. You've hit the nail on the head, because it's curation. You can find space for something, but it must be curated. And the nomenclature's changing. So you've got to keep an eye on change of names, even at generic level, pushing this from there to the other. I kept mine up to date, but now it's gone to Liverpool. I'm sure they're working their little hearts out.
Well, you know that we're not dandifying yours, it's already dandied. You know we're stacing yours, don't you?
Yes.
So that's a thing. So, and also Love Links plants that we're doing, that's all on stace.
Well, I talked about John Chandler, and he was a person, as I say, who got to know the location. And in the same way, when I moved to Yorkshire, I got to know all the elements that are needed to get some idea of the ecology of things, why they're living there and not there.
So you're talking, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, you're talking about a really deep connection to the land.
Yes.
A really deep, heartfelt, emotional connection to the land and the landscape and everything in it.
Absolutely.
And that's a lifetime's work.
It is, but you've got to use materials to do it. You can't do it just with the microscope. There's a chemistry in it. And much of my work has been looking at the deterioration of monuments. Most of my publications in Lincolnshire too, you will see that it's based on the fact that I'm looking at, in the case of churchyards, I've looked at 300 churchyards in Lincolnshire.
Wow, there's quite a lot of churchyards in Lincolnshire, aren't there?
Certainly are, yes.
Yeah.
And they're all telling wonderful, wonderful stories. And of course, they have to import stone, because sometimes the limestone doesn't work for them. And in doing so, you've got an importation of materials that would geologically wouldn't normally exist in the county. So you've got to separate off this sort of information.
So those different stones that are being imported into different places, they bring their own kind of micro environments with them, don't they? Is it a different, so are we getting different kind of...
Well, I don't know. I have seen this in the churchyard here. I've seen malum lichens, because they want to build gravestones out of unfashioned stone. So you have a monument that is a lumpy bit, but it's come from malum, and then you have a brass plaque on it. Those have got malum lichens on, but the others have been fashioned. It's starting from scratch. So you know somewhere in the air spora, these spores are there to land and establish.
So it's a good way of spreading those.
Well, it is, if you like, but if you're monitoring something, you've got a few difficulties. I monitored for most of my life pollution. First of all, air pollution in the form of metals. So the lichen is very slow growing, and it's picking up these metals, and you then analyze that lichen for those metals, and you can do them over time to see a change, and you do them over space. So if you've got the same lichen growing in the centre of the city, the one on the edge of the city and one out in the field, And in fact, you've got measurements of the same lichen, but it's doing different things.
And its proximity to sources of pollution, etc.
Yes, well, then I moved on, wait for it,
Okay, I'm waiting.
to the disaster, the Chernobyl disaster,
Ah,
because I started to do radioactivity. I say it happened at Chernobyl, it didn't. I was very, very lucky because I was the only one that had information prior to Chernobyl. So I'd been monitoring in Poland. I knew that the level of pollution of radioactivity was already 4 times higher than it should be.
pre-Chernobyl.
So after Chernobyl, they said it was 100 times higher than the starter. It was 100 times 4. It was 400 times higher. So I was monitoring radioactivity in lichens because they're formulating, they're producing a chemistry that reflects what's going on in the environment. And Lincolnshire, has it been included in all this work?
It has.
Not the radioactivity, but certainly the heavy metals. Yeah.
Okay, well that's interesting because we're not an industrial county, but we have got the
Suffer from your sins of your neighbour.
yes,
The Midlands have.
yes.
And this was long-range pollution. And the pollution in Lincolnshire today is actually not this sort of pollution that includes sulphur and the like, but it's nitrogen. It's the
Agriculture.
big pollutant. Yes, and heavy duty activities, farming,
Well, and I would say
and
probably
chicken,
the Air
chickens.
Force as well, and we get a lot of air pollution.
Yes, probably got more during the war.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I've thought about that. Yeah.
I've tried to monitor airways too, but
This is so amazing that you have done all of this work, and that Lincolnshire was kind of the spawning ground, if you like, where the spore of Professor Seaward was born, and then it spread across the nation and across the world.
well, I was very, very lucky. My first job was in Lincolnshire when I got my teacher training certificate. After graduating, I then went to work at Brigg Grammar School. And Brigg Grammar School was absolute delight. I would still be there now, but of course I had to move on. I had to move in to train teachers to do that job that I was doing. And I used to go out with the boys, and they were a sheer delight. And when we went out with the boys, we used to look in hedgerows. Of course, we don't have the hedgerows now, we did. And we had ditches in hedgerows. And we used to see junk in these things. And when we got back to the lab, they had to write a letter to the town clerk about the 100 metres, well, it was 100 yards then, the 100 yards of ditch that they'd just been analysed. And it built from that. We used to go out on the school playing field and cast quadrats to see how different the species were between the green in the middle for the cricket patch, the outfield, and the field beyond the boundary. So these sorts of little things were telling you all about the environment. And the people that lived in Lincolnshire over the years, and the naturalists we're talking about, also had these opportunities, but they didn't have, they were not monitoring things that were happening, like, for example, the loss of the hedgerow.
Well, the war had a big thing to do with the loss of hedgerows, didn't it?
It had a thing. The thing is to think about the naturalists. What did they do during the war? And some of them worked very, very hard to keep the subjects going. And Lincolnshire Naturalists Union was a very, very nice society to belong.
Yeah.
And Joan Gibbons, that you're interested in today, and John Charlton were eminent members of those societies.
So during the war, we know that Joan collected medicinal plants. And you're talking about the loss of species and species collapse. She actually collected a carload full of belladonna. I don't even know if there is any of that about in Lincolnshire anymore.
Oh, well, we've talked about this earlier, that, if you draw attention to something. But I collected with Joan as well. But also I collected as a junior during the war. I had no idea what we were doing. And we were often collecting nettles because they're very, very rich in chlorophyll and green. So you could dye canvas So for any camouflage, you collected these things. So I was collecting all sorts of things during the war.
Did you know that they also made fabric out of the nettles in the war? Because at Dunholm Scout Group, as a scouter, that they had in a glass cabinet, which we're hoping to get for this exhibition, a scout uniform, and it's made out of nettle fabric. Because we had to have some way of making fabric, because obviously the cotton didn't get through because of all the blockades.
I didn't know this, but
Yeah.
they'd be well camouflaged, wouldn't they?
Yes, they were.
Yes,
And
yes.
it's a really kind of a mucky kind of green, but it's probably old now as well. It's been affected by the light. So it wasn't just for the camouflage, it was for uniforms as well.
Well, although I was young, I was born just before the war, I must admit that I got to know the countryside very, very quickly. And at school, we used to have to uh, single plants, and we used to have to dig for potatoes and all sorts of things. And we got time off school to do these jobs. Uh, yeah, so there was an intimacy between us and the farming. And during the war, of course, I was actually evacuated, but I was evacuated to farms still in the county, which didn't seem a clever thing to do. And then they moved me to Teesside.
Oh, wow.
I was bombing the hell out of Teesside, so I came back to Lincoln.
Lincolnshire was
So I only
much
spent
safer.
literally weeks on my various things. I went to the coast, and I think there was strafing there with the practicing for the military on the coastline too. So I was shifted around a bit during the war, but I don't remember these things too much.
So how come you met Joan?
Well, I would have difficulty avoiding her because I reckoned to be a botanist. Of all my biological training, I said I was a botanist. And then, of course, Joan was the botanist for the county. But not only did she know about that, she knew everybody else in the county. So wherever you went, then you would say, Joan. But I was only an undergraduate, and I chose to do a topic in my final year, which involved mosses. Joan didn't know anything about mosses, but she was the botanist and the first port of call in getting information about who were the botanists that interested in mosses or in the past. And she did have a good knowledge, but her best knowledge was of the county. So when she drove her car, then she took you to all the places she knew where I would find something which was of value to me. The only downside to this was Joan's driving, because she would look out of the window to note plants that she was seeing in what were at that time very, very exciting hedgerows and the habitats that were provided. Yes, on one occasion she ran into the back of a lorry that halted too quickly, and she climbed out of the car. The engine had stopped and said, not much damage. And we drove on. Yes, she was a force to be reckoned with. She wasn't forceful all the time, because even in her family, there were members of her family, sisters and a brother, that were in a sort of a logical arrangement around the table.
All right.
So there were those that made their mark.
So there was a hierarchy.
There possibly was a hierarchy in various subject areas.
Yeah.
But Joan had the command of plans. And of course, the Lincolnshire Naturalists Union had field meetings, and they had field meetings every year where we all attended. They had committees, and I got my name on the record sheet fairly quickly that I was in charge of mosses. And very quickly, when I did my master's degree in Lincolnshire, Joan would help me on looking at the heathland plants, because it was essentially a heathland. It was Twigmore Warren near to Scunthorpe. And but then, of course, I needed the services of lots of other people, and realised also that I had a service to the county, that I was looking at something that had been looked at before, but nobody had got any feel for how are those plants, those lichens, those mosses, how were they surviving, because the changes were enormous.
Very rapid.
Yes,
Yeah.
very, very rapid. But fortunately, not in the time that I did my master's degree, because I did it externally at Nottingham, and I was still a teacher then, and I could get this degree and teach, which was really rather nice. But the changes were rapid.
It's nice that your collection, it's good that your collection's now at Kew though, isn't it? Because it would be a terrible shame for your life's work and a disaster for Lincolnshire if it was lost.
Ah, well, no, I'm sorry to have to correct you here.
Do you think?
It's Jones.
It's
Jones' collection in part is in Kew with all the previous collectors prior to her,
Okay,
particularly the man Woodruff Peacock that
okay.
I would like to emphasise.
But
But
what
my
about yours?
collection,
Yeah.
my collection's gone to Liverpool, and the sadness is it's gone to Liverpool because I tried in Lincolnshire and I tried all over Yorkshire. You cannot believe the two largest counties, and they have museums and universities and colleges and libraries, but you've got to have a curator to look after these things. And I couldn't find anywhere in Yorkshire
Would the
and
Natural
Northamptonshire.
History Museum not be interested? Could it not form part of the Lincolnshire's historical collection that's at the Natural History Museum?
If I put it in there, there's talk
Ah,
of moving Kew.
is it?
That's where the collections go. There's talk of moving Kew. This is a very, very difficult area. The other difficult thing is, if you've got plans, people want to inspect them. It's no use just having something that's not looked at. And you need the curator. But you also, in the past, you would put it in the post with a clear understanding that this material will be looked after and returned to you, sometimes with annotations and the like, making corrections. And the postal service was good enough to look after your material too. But now it costs an arm and a leg, and B, you wouldn't get this service from the postal service. And I think the museums are not keen to loan material. So if you've got a collection now, you've got to send it to somewhere. My collection, as I say, went to Liverpool, and they've accepted it with open arms. And I gave actually another collection to, you remember, the Spalding Gentlemen's Society. This is the Chandler collection.
We have it now.
Oh, I realise that, and I'm so happy about this.
Yeah.
But they had it there because Spalding seemed to be an ideal venue
Yeah.
in terms of the south of the county. I tried Stamford in the first case, where John lived.
Because he botanised Stamford as well, didn't he?
Yes. Well, John is very, very interesting in that although he lived in Lincolnshire, Stamford, you'll appreciate it's right there on the edge of Rutland and Northamptonshire. So, in fact, his name transpired on all sorts of documentation for those three counties, which each of them had their own societies too. But we're talking about Joan really. Joan was a figurehead in the botanical world, and she did write letters, and she did answer things, and she did move around, and was always present at meetings.
Was she self-taught?
She must have been. You never really, in those days, you never really challenged. At my age, I was only an undergraduate and a postgraduate when I got to know her. And then, of course, a teacher. But you never really cross-questioned them on that. You just knew that they had this wonderful ability to name a plant. And it wasn't just by a common name. It was by a Latin.
And also, the Lincolnshire Flora is a beautiful book, I think. And when you read it, it's not just about the flora, you know. She describes Lincolnshire, obviously loved Lincolnshire and the geology. Everything is in that book. And it's a marvellous book.
Right. Well,
Was it her that did that? Was it someone else that did it?
I was the one that actually monitored her in the very, very early days. And then while I was monitoring it, I left the county and it didn't seem right. But the actual format of the layout and the distribution, this big concept of distribution, that is all my idea. And somewhere I must have No, she would have my correspondent that laid this all out. And then David took over the job and rather interestingly maintained this thing, which looks a little bit old-fashioned today. If I was writing the floor again, I wouldn't do what we did. But Joan really benefited by this. And I used to go to the house to do this. There was a railway station at Holton-le-Moor, and then I had to walk across the green and go to the house.
So is it true that she kept her plant samples in envelopes under her bed?
You never asked these questions. I wouldn't be at all surprised,
Yeah.
but lots of them were in the collection, and I thought they were at Lincoln. Some of these, you think differently?
I'm not sure where they all are. They're kind of, because obviously Lincoln Museum, the collection, they're trying to, it's in a state of flux, the collections, aren't they? So
Everywhere.
So we're just trying to see where they are. But I don't know if you're interested, but your collection and John Chandler's collection, we've got a very wonderful lady called Gwyneth, who's a retired surgeon. And so we're actually going through them now, and we're making sure that they're being conserved properly, they're being repaired and restrapped and things like that.
Having a surgeon dissecting them.
Yes, it is. And so also, if there's loose material, we're making up DNA boxes for them and putting those on so that any loose material is collected as well, so that we are trying to, and obviously we're stacing your collection, even though you've classified it as dandy, so that we're trying to make it more contemporaneous.
Well, I wish now I'd given you a lot more of my original collections, but they developed into lichens and mosses, and essentially lichens. And these have been wonderful monitors of our environment, and particularly the Lincolnshire and Yorkshire environments.
Yeah. So actually the Lincolnshire flora as it stands, 50 years, it's the 50th anniversary next year, is a really amazing piece of botanical survey work, which is, I know it's a historical one as well, because we've got all sorts of people in there, haven't we? And Woodruff Peacock and Celine Stowe. But it is a really good benchmark, and it's really valuable moving forward.
That was Debbie Lincoln speaking to Professor Mark Seward, the distinguished British ecologist and lichenologist, whose contributions to environmental biology have shaped our understanding of pollution and biodiversity. That was a podcast for the Joseph Banks Society of Natural Sciences. If you would like more information on this subject or the work of the Joseph Banks Society, please go to our website www.joseph-banks.org.uk.